Welcome back to the Archives Book Club. So happy to have everybody listening and enjoying this. We were actually talking today about the statistics of how many people are downloading the podcast and listening on VODs and going to YouTube and listening live. And it's actually really pleased to see that there are a lot of people enjoying the
Mm-hmm.
Archives Book Club. So um, this is our fifth one. And this time we're going to be doing a book called the Talent Code. I was going to say the title of the podcast again, and I have the physical copy as well. And this is subtitled "The Greatness Isn't Born; It's Grown, and Here's How" by Daniel Coyle. I actually didn't read his blurb about as being an author,
Oh,
but
I
he
didn't either.
strikes me as sort of a sports writer. Yeah, I guess has done different projects outside magazine, et cetera, et cetera. So
Mm.
this is one of those books. If you guys have followed along with all of our books thus far, there have been a couple that get a little dry. There's some that get into the details that are tough to deal with, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like there are parts of the book written by the doctor in the checklist manifesto that was like, okay, it's getting a little bit boring, let's kick
Mm.
it up. This actually, I found this book to be very interesting cover to cover, and it's probably because the person's a writer first and found an interesting topic that involved a lot of science and
Mm-hmm.
cognitive psychology and learning and so forth, which makes it an easier read. So if you're looking for a book, this is an easy one, and it's like 200 pages. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
it's
not that
super
big.
quick.
It's a
Super.
thin book, so I would recommend to pick it up if you haven't listened to or read it already or listened to it on Audible. I almost called it Audacity.
Yeah,
So
for me, I like I said, I put myself on a schedule. I said I want to be done by such and such time to be able to do this, podcast stream. And it was something like I had to read like 15 pages of it a day. It was like so doable, right? And it was weird. I was in this funny rhythm where I kept actually ending a chapter like right when I was done with my like assigned reading for the night. It was kind of funny how I like caught the cadence of the book nicely.
yeah, so I think I kind of was very sporadic in the way I read this one. A lot of times with the books, I just read every day,
Mm-hmm.
and ironically, I was telling somebody Guitar Cheese maybe in Discord
Mm.
about like, yeah, you just set time
Yeah.
aside and you can read no problem. And I actually had a hard time doing that this past month
Mm-hmm.
to read this book, but actually the times I did sit down to read it, I really did enjoy it, and it read very quickly for me. It just was kind of sporadic, but it's a great book. And there, obviously, with all the books we do, there are parts I like, there are parts I don't
Mm-hmm.
like, and we'll get into it. But I guess we could just go right into the structure of this book compared to the structures of other books that we've
Yeah.
done, because it
Perfect.
seems to be where we start.
Mm-hmm.
And so with a lot of these sort of learning and psychology based books, or kind of how the brain functions based books, there's often this cookie cutter format of, let me tell you about a problem, let me tell you why your view of this problem is wrong, and let
Mm-hmm.
me tell you how we're going to solve that problem, right? And this book sort of does that, but it very quickly gets into some sort of interesting background. In like the first chapter, it's sort of putting this out there of like, okay, often when we see people who are very good at things, the first thing that people say is, "Oh, what talent!
Yeah.
They're so gifted. They're so lucky to be who they are, etc." And it wants to, basically, the thesis of the book is wants to debunk that
Mm-hmm.
for the most part. And I found it actually like a micro version of the cookie cutter format that we've seen before, where it's just very quickly like, we're just going to jump right into the research after like a very short introduction.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of interesting. And personally, after reading five of these types of books now in a row,
Mm-hmm.
I guess I don't need any more convincing.
Yeah. 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 Right.
I think I agree. Like, yeah, this is we can think about learning in a different way, and we can kind of approach learning in a different way. And I don't need to be convinced that talent isn't a genetic inherited trait. Rather, it's just through hard work and practice, which we'll
Mm-hmm.
see soon. So that was kind of an interesting thing for me. But I might be now in the jaded category of like, okay, I just almost can skip the first chapter of the
Right.
book. Um, but it is interesting, and the key word here is myelin. And I think, Eric, you started us off strong with a myelin comment, or I don't know how you say it actually. Is it myelin? Would you say myelin? Do you say myelin?
I think it's myelin. I mean, I guess I
Okay.
could ask the Google, but like, um, yeah, I don't actually know how to say it.
I didn't check beforehand, so I'm not sure either.
We totally should have done that. Like all of the results are just medical information. There's no, and I never know how to read these dictionary things anyway. But like,
Let me see. Define
like
myelin.
here, I'll
Sometimes if you tell it define,
for
yeah,
the
yeah.
chat, it says
Myelin.
this. Like that's myelin. You know how to read
Yeah.
these weird things.
So if you type in Google, I'm gonna learn you on Google, right?
Okay.
If you type in the words define and then a
Mm-hmm.
word you're looking for it to pronounce,
Right.
it'll come up. The first thing will have a little sound
Mm-hmm.
icon. You click that next to the sound icon, and it pronounces it for you.
Got it. Okay. I thought you were reading my Twitch chat with these funny alien symbols, but okay.
Oh, I do see the alien symbols, but I do not know how to read the backwards upside down E.
Okay. I presume that it's an eh sound now that we know that it's pronounced myelin. So in any
Yeah.
case, back to what the hell is myelin? Were you looking for me to do that, or did you want to do that?
Yeah, well, so you had a comment right off the bat
Oh,
here
okay.
of myelin stuff, and I
Yeah,
just
yeah,
thought it
yeah.
was fun to read that one. So
Sure. So I'll go ahead and just read this from the show notes to everybody. So what I wrote was myelin stuff is interesting, but he beats it to death in the book. And so I guess this would be like my one caveat for I think Adderseth's pitch is very true. Like it is a super compelling book, but if you're one of those people who's turned off of dry sciencey stuff, either hang in there or skim or skip the first like two, I want to say, chapters because he really just fetishizes the hell out of this
hmm
myelin research. Like he's and I mean, God bless him, man. Like he's very passionate about the topic, but like and even it is threaded throughout a little bit. Like he calls back to that first chapter, like a little quote from that first chapter over and over and over again. I'm like, I get it, dude. Myelin's cool. Like, great. Let's talk about applications. But um, yeah. So what is it actually? Right. It's it's insulation that wraps around the fibers in your brain that do like the neural pathways. And I forget the rest of like the science of exactly how it works. Maybe Adderseth can fill that in. But the gist is the more of this insulation you have, the more reliable the signal, the more likely you are to keep whatever that signal represents, and the faster it can transmit. Is that about right?
yeah, and this is so. I nerded out on the science part of it, because it did go into like research and who did the research, and it did have quite a bit of like the history of neuroscience,
Mm.
which I find very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a neuroscientist, but it's one of those fields that I could have seen myself going into,
Mm-hmm.
instead of earth science. Physics and neuroscience were like two pathways that I was very interested in for a
Mm.
while, and I sort of didn't go into them, but I'd still find them interesting. And yeah, essentially it's true, and we're probably going to butcher this a little bit. So a neuroscientist is going to be like, that's not how it works. But there's like, neurons and synapses, and the neurons are sending signals to the synapses, or vice versa. It doesn't matter really. But the thing is that the myelin is the thing that insulates the connection between the two of them. And up until the 80s, 90s, even then, it was still not well understood. And the thinking was that myelin was just kind of this like thing that was there that really wasn't that important. And until recently, since the 2000s, more or less, researchers have been finding that myelin is actually extremely important for getting that signal between the two parts of the brain in a fast and coherent manner. So essentially you can think of it as like if you have a long actual physical copper cable or something like that, or an internet cable, you lose signal strength as the cable gets longer and longer, right? Or you degrade the signal. And so how do you do that? You can bump up the energy and give it a lot of insulation so it stays strong for a further distance.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a kind of weak analogy, but this is sort of what's going on in the brain, it turns out, with myelin. At least that's what the researchers were. And for any super nerds out there is part of the book that talks about Einstein's brain. And believe me, I read all the footnotes because I was like super interested in that part. Um, there was a research that did an autopsy on part of Einstein's brain and saw that there was actually a lot of myelin in there, but at the time no one really understood why. And it has to do with this growing of a physical part of the brain that is improving the signal capability or the signal transmission within the brain, which is really, I think, very interesting. But like Eric said, you could kind of skip that, and you can get right to the part. If you're interested more about like, well, how do I get good at something? Like, yeah, just go to chapter 3 or 4. It's just, you don't even need that part.
I mean,
But it is kind of a historical, checklist, so to speak.
to be fair, I made it sound probably worse than it really was. Like it is actually interesting, right? So the notion that for however long we've had neuroscience up until like literally the 90s or so, we thought that it was synapses and neurons and the underlying structure of how that's connected, right? That maybe Adraseth's is better than mine, the shape of his connections, and so that makes him better at Starcraft. And we come to find out it isn't that at all. It's how well you wrap those connections. And we could have, I mean, we don't, but we could have literally the exact same structure in our heads. And if his is insulated better by more myelin, he's going to be faster, more effective, lose skill less as he ages, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's why the Einstein anecdote is really kind of cool, right? Because they did this autopsy, back whenever they did it. And they're like, huh, that's funny. He's got a lot of this stuff. Okay, whatever. And they kind of kept it moving. And, fast forward to the 90s, we realized, oh, actually, that turned out to be super important and kind of neat, right? That he had so much of it.
Yeah, and I think one thing that it does point out in the book and that we should be very careful of clarifying as well, and you said it, is that so when we learn as humans, as we learn something new, we make a new connection in the brain to do that, right? So when we learn to walk, we're making new connections in the brain. But as anyone who's ever seen a toddler walk, they walk sort of like Frankenstein, right? Really uncoordinated, right? You've seen the baby walk if you've been around children. And in order for them to walk like an adult or learn how to walk like other kids that are older, they have to begin wrapping that connection with myelin. And the more myelin they wrap, the better that skill gets. And that's really the key here. So this book lays it out that after you've learned the new skill, now it's all about myelin building. And it's not about, improving the signal or improving that connection. It's actually about insulating that connection. And like Eric said, and we're going to talk more about, is that the better the insulation, the less degradation you have over time, the faster that connection works, the smarter, or the higher skill level, not smarter, but the higher skill level you can get at. So that's kind of an interesting thing.
Yeah, for sure. So let's see. You had some quotes, it looks like.
Yeah, so I actually want to just jump right into, I don't often do this. Usually what we do is I kind of summarize my quotes in the book, but there's actually this part of the book that I really wanted to just read a couple sentences directly out of here. So there's this sort of on my copy, page 44, there's sort of a here's the fundamental principles of myelin. And these are sort of repeated and echoed throughout the book, which is important. But we can talk about each one of them because I think it's kind of interesting. So number one, the firing circuit is paramount. Myelin is not built to respond to fond wishes or vague ideas. The information that washes over us like a warm bath. The mechanism is built to respond to actions. And so it's myelin's like, you have to train. I think the key is like you have to be very deliberate in building myelin, right? So this is like when the baby's learning to walk, the baby has to like practice walking, right? Myelin is universal, one size fits all skills, and myelin doesn't know whether it's being used for playing shortstop or playing Schubert. So myelin is universal in its skills, right? So it's like basically, again, once you've made the connection, you're wrapping the connection. The third one here, which I have a little bit of a caveat with because he sort of contradicts himself later on in the book, is myelin wraps, it doesn't unwrap. Like a highway paving machine, myelination happens in one direction. Once a skill is insulated, you can't uninsulate it except through age or disease. And we'll come back to that in a second. And then the fourth one, which, sorry to say, but we knew this, right? We know that older people learn a little bit slower, or
Mm-hmm.
they get better at things a little bit slower than younger people. This is what we say a lot of times. And I also have a caveat with this one as well.
Mm-hmm.
Age matters. In children, myelin arrives in series of waves, some of them determined by genes, some of them dependent on activity.
Mm-hmm.
So the first two, I really, I agree. I kind of read it. I was like, yeah, that makes sense. So, I
Mm-hmm.
agree with the research and all that. The second two, I kind of have some talking points about.
Yeah.
But the thing is about the myelin wrap. So I'll start there with myelin wraps, and it doesn't unwrap.
Mm-hmm.
So this is when I read that, and I actually made like a mental note, and I think I jumped over to the Google Doc and like page 44. I need to talk about this. And when I read that, I thought, okay, this is why you can learn to ride a bicycle, and you never forget how to ride a bicycle, right? However, and this is something that I tried to then reconcile later on through the book, is that if you don't do something for a while, your skill degrades,
Mm-hmm.
right? Skills are sort of perishable. So like you never unlearn how to ride a bicycle, but it doesn't mean that you're as good as you were when you were a kid riding a bicycle if you haven't ridden one for 10 years as an
Mm-hmm.
adult.
Mm-hmm.
And being somebody who's competed in cycling, and I ride a bicycle everywhere still to this day, I've met people who are like, oh, I haven't ridden a bicycle since I was 12, and I'm worried I would fall over.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, like, no, they won't fall over, right? But they definitely can't ride and control a bicycle like I can. And I don't know if anybody here knows what a track stand is, but I can do a track stand very easy with no hands. And a track stand is basically balancing the bike on two wheels without touching the ground with your feet. And I can do that with no hands.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's extremely easy to do this. I don't think about it. I can just do it. So it's like almost like riding a unicycle, if you will. And obviously, friends of mine who have said, like, I can't ride a bicycle, or I'm unable to ride a bicycle without falling over. It's that they do know how to ride a bicycle, but they don't have the myelination to sort of let them have the coordination that I would have.
Right.
And that all being said, I don't know how, like later on they talks about it, that if you don't use a skill, it sort of does degrade. And I don't know how that plays into myelin, because he never gets into that part of it.
Right.
If the myelin doesn't unwrap, why does the skill degrade? And I don't know, maybe you picked up on that?
I didn't, but as you're saying it, it totally makes sense to me, right? Like it almost feels as though there's something that we don't yet understand about how the neuroscience works, right? So I've experienced
Yeah.
this with a handful of skills. So here, let me like really out myself as a nerd. So I spent a great number of years being a huge Warhammer guy. And I was always into, so for people who don't know, it's a tabletop war game. Instead of like, you imagine like your little kid playing with like action figures or army men going pew pew pew, okay, my guy killed your guy, and then you argue about it with your friend for like a half an hour. Instead, what you do as grown men is you roll dice to settle the argument, basically. That's what Warhammer is. So I was always more into it. Holy, we got a big boy
Whoa,
raid
big
coming
old
in.
raid.
Welcome to the Pig fam. Thank you so much, Pig. Really appreciate it. I feel like we should reset a little bit now that we got 600 plus of y'all in here.
600 people coming in to the middle of our introduction of our podcast.
So, welcome. This is the Archives Book Club. I could see from the chat spam, teach me how to learn. Everybody already kind of knows what's going on, but essentially, what Andrew, Seth, and I are doing here is every month we pick a book. Sometimes we have a guest. I think it was last episode or the one before we had Printf on. Yeah, the book this month is The Talent Code. And it's all about the neuroscience of acquiring and keeping skill. We're talking about this not just in the context of, dry sort of neuroscience stuff and acquiring skill. We're talking about it specifically with a lens on Starcraft. So, we don't have all the answers here. We're a couple of guys in, mid or Adverseth's case, high diamond, just trying to get better and trying to leverage the available literature to the best of our ability. So that's what the show's about. I hope you enjoy your time here. Yeah. So, Adverseth, do you want to just reset on kind of quickly what the book is, I guess?
Yeah, so for all 600 of you coming in and just recently joining us, for the people who were previously in chat, like, Just hang on, we're gonna get there, right? We'll get through it together. The talent code begins with this story about myelin, and myelin is this insulator in the brain that connects your neurons and synapses and allows skills to improve, and it sort of helps signals get transmitted maybe with less degradation or greater speed or something like that. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I don't know exactly how it works, but basically the book begins with this idea of how do we build myelin in our brains so that we get better at skills. And fundamentally, we often say like, this so and so is so talented, or they're so good and they're genetically gifted to be good, or I could never be like X because X is just lucky in life and they got gifted. And that's really not true according to science, that you can build skills through this myelin. And myelin is really important in getting better at stuff. And so what we talked about just a little bit ago is that um, to learn a skill, you make a connection in the brain. And once you learn it, like a baby learning to walk, you're not good at it, but you can do it. To get good at something, you have to build this myelin insulation wrapping along those connections. And by doing that, that's when your skill blossoms. And that's really where you get to a high level of either coordination if you're walking. But in our case, what we're relating this to is Starcraft. And so how do we get good at Starcraft? And what are the key things to do to get good at Starcraft? And we haven't even really touched on practice and things that are in the book. So we're hopefully catch you guys up right now to that point.
Mm-hmm.
And what we were just talking about right before the host came in was that there are some parts in the book that are talking about basically myelin never goes away unless you get sort of dementia or some mental diseases with old age. And when I read that in the book, we were talking about how that made me think about learning to ride a bike and never having to relearn to ride a bike.
Mm-hmm.
But then there is a contradiction there because, and like Eric was saying, we don't quite understand how myelin works 100% yet, because myelin may degrade, or the connection may degrade in some way, because if you don't practice something, anybody who's played StarCraft knows you go 1 week without playing and you come back and you try and do your high
Yep.
micro really cool build that's whatever, right? You're going to do your super awesome cool build and you can't do it as well.
Yep.
Or you go to micro your units, you get your bioforce and you stim them up, and you ever heard a pro player say, my hands aren't doing what I want them to,
Mm-hmm.
right? They know how to do it, they can't pull it off.
Yep.
And we know that happens. And I think probably, Eric, you're totally right about this, is that we just still don't know the full
Mm-hmm.
story with the neuroscience.
Yeah. So the anecdote that I was in the middle of telling when Adgerseth got, or when Pig got here with the big raid, was kind of an example of this. Adgerseth told one about riding a bike. For me, this has certainly been true in StarCraft. But I was heavy into Warhammer for a very long time, and I was always into like the whole hobby, right? Like playing the game, painting the miniatures, like the story, the whole thing. And I actually studied under the Golden Demon is like the big award for painting, and I studied under a Golden Demon award-winning painter in Warhammer, and for years he taught me how to do it. And there'd be times where I'd get interested in something else and I'd kind of wander away and come back. And I felt that thing that you're talking about where it's like, I kind of like still know what I'm supposed to be doing, but I can't make my hands do it. I can't like paint as well. And he would always tell me, just chill, like it'll snap back. And that's kind of the sensation that I have with StarCraft as well. So I just came off of like this monstrously disruptive, like job hunt, life disaster thing where I didn't play StarCraft for like, I don't know, 2 months or something. And I'm streaming tomorrow night. It's like my debut back to like ladder streaming, and I'm scared, right? So I've been playing a couple games off stream. Don't tell anybody. I almost always stream all my ladder, right? And I had the same thing last night where I'm in a PvT, I'm kind of taking an ass kicking from like Widow Mines and whatnot, and I'm like, my mini map awareness used to be better than this. Like I used to kind of have it a little bit more. But at the same time, I was surprised like to still get placed in Diamond, right? Like it isn't like it completely goes away. You're just a little shaky. So I don't know, and the book doesn't cover what the neuroscience of that is, but there's definitely something there that either the book doesn't cover or we literally haven't figured out neuroscientifically.
I would probably lean towards we haven't figured out.
Mm.
Um, and I mean, you picked what a fantastic time to come back to, because now we have new maps as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an extra layer of complexity that you're
Great,
gonna have
yeah.
to deal with. But it's a very interesting point. It stuck out to me, and that was just very early on in the book. The other one that I love to get into, because I'm an old guy, right? I'm in my 30s. I'm in my mid 30s. I'm younger than Artosis. That's all I got going for me. But is that
Same.
age? So myelin grows with these growth spurts in age. So and it makes complete sense. I'm not teaching children, right? I only teach like adults. But like when I've seen kids learn, not every kid learns at the same rate, and not every kid gets good at skills at the same rate. And this explains it very well, is that myelin just sort of happens, like growth spurts happen for children. That's why they're not all the same size
Mm-hmm.
and the same height, right? And so um, myelination and growth of myelin is pretty consistent all the way through your 20s, probably up to 30-ish, right? Seems to be the statistic they throw out in the book. And then once you get into your 30s, it slows down. You can still grow it, but it slows down. And as you get older and older and older, it really slows down. And once you get past your 50s, then you're not growing as much new myelin as you're losing. And this is an interesting thing, because I'm sure that, like they say in the book, like mental diseases like Parkinson's and dementia and Alzheimer's are probably related to loss of this type of cell or this type of material in the brain. And, if they could figure that out, that would be tremendous for medical science as well. But the way that I thought about this too, being an old guy that plays video games, right? So like I play a lot of video games, and I want to get good at Starcraft, and which we've already had conversations about, like what is good at Starcraft. But I want to get better than I'm at
Mm-hmm.
now at Starcraft, which pretty much everybody who's watching Pig stream probably wants to do that too, right? I could say that with a lot of confidence. If you're watching Pig, he's an amazing coach, right? You can listen to his commentary and you try and pick up things and learn and get better about StarCraft. Well, as you get older, it's going to be harder for you. Artosis has talked about this too, especially on his stream and on the Pylon Show and other places, is that being older, it's harder to get good at things, getting better. It just means it's going to take you more work than it would take Rainer, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of this sort of thing that I keep in mind, because being somebody who's in their 30s, like it makes me think of like, how much effort am I putting into this game to get better at it, and is it worth it? And then I see other people who like Printf, who get to masters with just using a keyboard. And it's like, okay, I got some work to do for myself. But don't get discouraged if you're an older player and you want to get better at StarCraft. You can still do it. It's just going to take more work.
That Printf keyboard thing stung a little bit, man. When I saw that in Discord, I'm not gonna lie, that one hurt.
Yeah.
But you know,
So then,
I will say really quickly. Sorry to cut you off, after
yeah.
the bit about getting that boost of, or that last like big wave of myelin in your 30s is a little bit heartening for me, right? Because it's like, okay, it's not over yet. Somewhere in the next handful of years, I can expect like that last wave. So I better like really get on top of my shit now, because this is like your last chance, right? But okay, apparently I'm getting a Windows update. Sorry about that. Address cam got blocked for a second.
That's all right.
Cool. Yeah, that was all. That was my little anecdote there.
Yeah, I mean, and and I'm sure, just like anything in biology and neuroscience and cognitive psychology and those fields, that it's not a one-to-one correlation. Like there's no one size fits all. For each human being is kind of a weird individual from each other human being. So there are weird cases. There are times where older people become like world class at something very late in life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's rare, but it does happen. So they're the outliers that also can mean that, well, it is possible to do that. And I recall, I used to read a lot of Tim Ferriss's stuff, and I recall him relating this to about a swimmer, and I can't think of the swimmer's name, but the guy was like in his late 30s or 40s and became like very, very top level in the master class of swimming in his age group. And that's very unusual, because usually that doesn't happen. People sort of get really good when they're young, and we see that in video games. And there's, I think, we've talked about it and other people have talked about it, but there's probably a couple reasons for that. One being less obligations when you're younger, so you have more time to practice, and also just being younger, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so things like, and this is also very interesting when I read this or thought about it as well, is that like uh, there, if you look at the record of like Cyril or Rayner or some of these younger guys that are up and coming, or well, the best maybe in the world, um, they sort of have this like not stagnant people that period. They're very good, but they get really good and they
Mm-hmm.
do these big jumps. And I
Yeah.
wonder if these big jumps are related to like, strong growth in myelin during certain periods in their
Mm.
life where they're doing a certain task like Starcraft,
I wonder,
and they go
yeah.
from being like a decent player to like holy crap a good player.
Mm-hmm.
Future just had this happen, right?
Mm.
Future of Terran.
My
Future was like
boy.
somebody that just showed up out of nowhere, right? And he was probably good, but then all of a sudden he's beating Neeb, and it's like, whoa, that's really good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm glad we got a little future shout out, little Infinity Gaming love. I like it. No agenda there at all. I didn't put Adderset up to it. Um,
So if we move down our show notes
yeah,
list,
yeah,
um, what I have just a few points to like, and then we can kind of wrap this little part up, because I think what we really want to know is about the practice part,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
right? So as
Totally.
StarCraft players, that's where we start to get really interesting. What do we need to do to get better? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
science aside, like I want to know what to do to get better. But basically, there's some key parts that I just highlighted, and that is myelin takes repetitions, which we know, right? If you practice anything, repetitions are important. And it's not a tape recorder. It says this literally in the book. It's not a
Mm-hmm.
tape recorder. It's a living structure. In other
Mm-hmm.
words, it's can be manipulated. If you make a bad habit, you can fix it, right? You
Mm-hmm.
don't always do the same thing every time. So
Right.
you have to kind of keep that in mind. And as a precursor to the practicing part, um, he actually is kind of insinuates this, but doesn't say it, I think, directly, is that you have to have goals that are beyond your ability. In
Mm-hmm.
other words, you have to stress yourself
Yep.
to get better. And this was something that I thought I didn't necessarily occur to me in StarCraft, although sometimes I've done it because I'm a chronic grinder of games. Like I just keep playing more and more games. And like if I want to get better, I just put more hours in, right?
Right.
But you have to, like working out in the gym, actually increase the weight limit. You have to
Mm-hmm.
increase the stress level on yourself to get better.
Yep.
And it is an interesting thing when I thought back to myself, like when I was in bronze or silver or gold or platinum. Uh, there were times where I didn't know what certain units were, and I was afraid to use those units
Mm-hmm.
because I didn't want to lose.
Yep.
I was like, the Oracle seems like a really hard unit to use. I don't want to do that. I'd rather just stick with what I know, make gateway units, and win the game that way. But if you want to get better, you got to stress yourself, and it means you're going to lose games,
Yeah.
but it will improve you. And I thought that was a really interesting thing.
Yeah, it goes along with some of the earlier episodes we've done too. I think, gosh, which book covers that? I think Make It Stick talks about this the most,
Yeah, I think it's in Make It Stick as well.
where the notion of the real learning happening during that icky feeling where you're like, I'm trying to do something and it's like just on the outside of my skill range, and that feeling is just miserable. Like you feel so clumsy and so gross, and you're like making all these mistakes. And in StarCraft, you're bleeding out MMR all over the place and dropping down in the basement of your league or whatever. But that really is like what makes the skill develop. Funny you say the thing about not using units. I had two thoughts there. One is I am still afraid to use oracles, and I still don't like making stargates ever. Anybody who watches my stream will know that. But the other thing is my like one of my very first interactions with Adderseth when I was like Silver League maybe was I came into his stream and I met him and I was whining about PVT like I still am today. And I said, I can't figure this matchup out, man. Like, do you have any advice? And he's like, just make High Templars and use Storm, because Storm's really good. And I was afraid to do it, right? But I took his advice and I won some games. Like, and my skill grew, more importantly, right? And now you've kind of expanded your range, and that edge of where your skill is further out. And so I guess the question is, how do you systematically continue to do that when the skills we're talking about get fuzzier, right? That's where I'm having a hard time, in Diamond League, like the skills are a little bit harder to define than learn how to, click a storm on a bunch of zerglings or whatever.
Hmm. And yeah, in I can think of a number of examples of this, but like one that strikes me is that in Diamond League, you don't often see Zerg players use infestors or vipers.
Mm,
I would say it's more rare than it is common.
mm-hmm.
And in Masters, that's when players start to use vipers and infestors.
Mm,
And so whenever I hit a Masters player, then it's a pretty obvious thing. Like they had taken the time to learn how to use those units, know how to cast spells and
mm-hmm.
protect them and not get them sniped or whatever. And they start using them, and all of a sudden their skill goes way up
Yeah.
because now they have this new tool in the toolbox that is quite strong. And the same way with High Templar and Protoss, if you play Protoss and you're not using High Templar yet, or you don't know how to use High Templar, or you used High Templar once and they all died because they clumped up and got EMP'd, um, you have to practice with them. And another great example is the disruptor, right? And
Mm-hmm.
anybody who's watched M Canning for 3 seconds has seen amazing disruptor shots. And you have to look back and see that M Canning has learned how to use the disruptor for
Yeah.
years, and he's very, very good at it. And it's the same thing, is that when you're learning Starcraft, in my experience, is to stress yourself out with those new units is actually really great. And now with this book, we actually have scientific backup to this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Stressing yourself while practicing is what you need to do, and that
Yeah.
will help you build this myelin connection.
And to be clear, when we say stressing yourself here, we don't mean the feeling of being anxious and stressed out, right? Because that's something I talk about a lot on my stream, like trying to not have that. Because me personally, like I have a very high emotional response to stuff just generally, and I do not learn efficiently if I feel anxious, if I feel put on the spot, if I think Twitch chat is judging me, any of that kind of stuff, right? Um, what it's about is, think of it like what Adderseth is saying with the gym, right? Like stressing your muscles, where it's like, yeah, I can kind of, sort of, leg press or squat this much or whatever, and my muscles are straining to do it, but I'm able to succeed, right? So just making it a little bit difficult. One other thing that I forgot to say, along the lines of um, kind of being able to change bad habits, right? That this is one of your earlier points. Um, I thought it was interesting that he talks about, the myelin has wrapped whatever that bad habit is. It's not really going away until you get old. So what you're trying to do then when you fix a bad habit is create an alternate pathway and wrap the hell out of that pathway such that it is stronger and it is the preferred route that you go down, right? So that is now how I'm conceptualizing bad habits. And furthermore, I'm thinking about it in, like, not just StarCraft, but like holistically in life. Like, now it's almost like I think of anything that I do as reinforcing whatever that action is, right? So if I'm in a shitty mood, right, I'm just like going about my life being pissed or whatever, I don't want to do that because I don't want to be in a shitty mood next year, right? So like I try to fight it, not just because I don't want to be an unpleasant person to be around, but because I don't want to like continue to reinforce whatever those like bad personality habits are and that kind of thing. Um, anyway, not to derail too far, but that's just kind of how I've been thinking about myelin in the context of like altering, things that I think of as mistakes or bad habits or whatnot.
Yeah. I just want to say, like, I see a lot of good discussion going on in the
Yeah.
chat. We will have time at the end to do some Q&A.
Mm-hmm.
So if you do stick around for the next hour or so, we'll have some time to address some of your questions. We'll do our best. So I love that you guys are talking right now about what we're talking about. And this is exactly why we started this. Well,
Mm-hmm.
I think we started this for the two of us, actually. We wanted to talk about learning and get better at StarCraft between ourselves, but I'm glad that people are having a good time discussing things in chat. So we will get to you.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I approach Adderseth about this because I'm like, look, man, I'm reading these books and I can't figure it out. Like, I accept that the stuff in these books is probably true, and I like these concepts, but I cannot figure out how to apply it to StarCraft, and I want to because I want to get better. I'm sick of being stuck in Diamond. So hopefully everybody in the chat can be along for the journey. We're definitely down to discuss with you all.
yeah. So moving along in the book, the next section is sort of titled "The Holy Shit Experience," and this is what he's talking about is that when you have these sort of epiphanies, breakthroughs, or you see somebody do something that's just incredible,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I think everybody has seen amazing things happen in Starcraft, and they
Mm-hmm.
see a game, they're just like, what did that person just do? Is
Yep.
that unbelievable? Uh, and I can relate it because I sometimes watch CS:GO. I'll admit it. But you see these like crazy 360 no scope shit that like people will do, and you're just like, how is that even possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like especially in a pro match,
Yeah.
or just like an ace kill of the team that is just phenomenal reaction time and just great positioning and
Mm-hmm.
sort of the pinnacle of skill. And this is what the author's talking about, is this
Mm-hmm.
sort of like, whoa, where did that come from? And it comes from practice.
Right. Yeah, it could be, another thing is like you see that player who was like, kind of good WCS contender, whatever, all of a sudden is like slaughtering everyone, right? Like, where did that come from? Well, it either came from, the, like you're talking about, age based burst in myelin, or they changed something about how they were training, right? Maybe they got coaching from the right person who said the right thing, gave them the right cue to direct their practice. And for me, this is what I'm super interested in, right? Like, I've been pretty hard stuck at a certain MMR for a while, and it's like trending upwards, but so slow compared to when I was bronze. And it was very simple to be like, this is what you need to work on, do this, not that. And I would off stream go and I would try to, not supply block or do a build order or whatever, and instantly make the mistake, leave the game, go back and correct it. And you can iterate very rapidly, right? Um, so I think that what you're seeing when you see that holy shit experience moment with StarCraft players is one of those two things. It has to be, right? So,
Yeah.
along these lines, another thing that the author talks about in the book is this concept of the 10,000 hour rule. And this is one of the only things in the book where I kind of took issue a little bit. And I made a little mental note that I kind of had an axe to grind about this one, because the author acknowledges the so-called 10,000 hour rule, which is of course takes 10,000 hours to develop mastery in any skill. He kind of takes this as gospel, and I don't really get how he can say that, but then also, turn around and tell me that, well, the way you practice is really critical to your skill growth. Like, to me, it seems to be one or the other. Either it takes 10,000 hours, right? That is your flat fee to get good at a thing, or how you apply your time matters, right? It doesn't seem to me that it can be both. So I almost wonder if a better way to think about it is that we have observed that mastery occurs if you invest 10,000 hours, right? And maybe the way that that happens is if you commit just mass amounts of time and jam games, you will blunder into the correct cues and the correct training as a matter of course. Like, it's gonna be the graph is like a step function, right? Um, but you kind of just like aimlessly blunder into the right stuff to do. That would add up to me as a way of reconciling the two. But I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on that, Dr. Seth.
Yeah, this is something that struck me as well, is that we all, maybe not we all, but like definitely myself, and I think people that come to your stream and come to
Mm-hmm.
my stream, and uh, we talk about this like, oh, to be an expert, you need to have X number of hours invested. Usually we talk about it as games,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So in StarCraft, we have a game counter. It's pretty obvious, right? You could just be, oh, I have 5,000 games on this account.
Mm-hmm.
I'm this skill level. And I actually started doing this a little bit, kind of sneaking around and asking some people who have hit
Mm.
GM, like, how many games did it take you to get to GM? And I found actually quite a big disparity in that. But again, there could be other reasons for that. And so I think it is sort of a combination of multiple things, right? If you put 10,000 hours into something, you're going to get good. That's actually sort of guaranteed. Will you be world class? Not guaranteed that,
Right. Right.
but you will get good. And the question is, during your 10,000 hour journey, are you going to hit the right combination of practice routines or right combination of things that you need to grow myelin, right? Which we know is the important thing that keeps getting hit, like, hammered into us in this book. But will you hit the right number of combination of practice steps or whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
so that you can become that 0.1% player or that 0.1% athlete or
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is? And so, um, it's kind of an interesting thing because I can't, like I probably do have 10,000 hours in something in my life, but I've not logged down, like, I can't like point to something other than video games where you actually have counters in them, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you play WoW, for example, you can type /played and you get how
Yep.
many hours and so on you played in there. And it's a difficult thing for me to reconcile other than yes, and that's the conventional wisdom we've had for a long time in Starcraft is like, well, just play more games, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've heard streamers, big streamers even say that, but like, well, you probably just don't play enough games.
Mm-hmm.
And that may be true, but there also could be the problem of, well, you're not practicing, right? Or you're not practicing the right way, or you're not practicing at all,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when you do something and you're repeating it, if you're not targeting things to get better at, then you may not actually get better. And if you're not targeting them the right way, you may not get better. And then even worse, you may develop bad habits.
Yeah. Yeah, you could be reinforcing the exact same bad habits that are keeping you stuck at whatever place that you're stuck at, right? And and in that case, if you're in kind of that mode, the just play more games is actually hurting you, right? You're in fact wrapping and wrapping and wrapping those mistakes and creating an even higher wall for yourself to clear once you do figure out that they are mistakes and that you need to fix them, right?
Yeah. And this is here's the big difficult question that I came up with and thought about, and I'm not sure we're going to have the answer. I'm not sure we're going to be able to like solve all the world's problems tonight, but it's definitely food for thought. And this is exactly why we do this: is how do we practice in StarCraft?
Mm-hmm.
What is the key to practicing in StarCraft? And in the book, they talk about many different things, everything from football, soccer, to baseball, to
Music.
playing the violin, to playing the piano, to being like good at your profession, all these different types of things that people are good at. And one of the examples they gave with the music school was that the students were taking, instead of playing sheet music and like playing a piece just straight through or messing around with a piece or learning a piece and playing it, they are actually cutting up the measures and mixing them up
Mm-hmm.
and then trying to play them without any context. And what that, and I actually tried this, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
play a couple different instruments. So I tried this, and it's such a stress on your brain because it's like you want to complete melodies, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
we are sort of ingrained to like complete melodies. It's like Beethoven's Fifth, like da na na,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
probably everyone just heard the
yeah.
right,
Mm-hmm.
like the last note there. So if you start playing different melodies and different measures and different time signatures all jumbled together, but just try to get the notes and try to get them together, it is so hard to do. And yet you can feel there's this sort of like stressful learning going on.
Mm-hmm.
And as you get better, um, it becomes easier. And I actually remember this when I learned the core for StarCraft.
Ah.
I came back to the game. I did not play HOTS. I came back to the game in Legacy, and I thought, okay, I'm playing a little bit. And I was in Gold League, I think, and or maybe I made it to Platinum. And I'd heard some of these, this new thing about the core, and that Pig used the core, and I think Neuro uses the
Mm-hmm.
core, and TLO uses the core, and all. I was like, what is this? What is this all about? And I find out, Jack Attack made this interesting keyboard layout, and I thought about it. And I thought about it. I'm like, okay, I want to learn it. I think it's cool. I'm going to do it. So I set about learning it, and it was like so painfully hard, right? And I wanted to quit. I really did. I was like, after like 3 games, I was just like, this is dumb, right? I'm losing every game to stupid stuff because I can't build a unit because I don't
Mm-hmm.
know what buttons are what, and I don't want to do it anymore. But I stuck with it, despite that feeling. I stuck with it, and there was a very satisfying progression,
Mm-hmm.
which it was actually quite rapid. Now it took me, I would say, about 3 months to really feel comfortable with it. But in the first week, I felt comfortable after a couple of days, and like more comfortable after a
Mm-hmm.
couple of days. I was still losing games like crazy, and I actually dropped all the way down to low gold or maybe even silver, and had to work my way back up. But once it
Mm.
clicked, I just went straight through those leagues because I was using camera locations that I'd never
Yeah.
been using before. I can have like 6 different camera locations. I maybe used 2 before.
Mm-hmm.
I could use 8 different control groups. I maybe used 3 or 1. Well,
Mm-hmm.
actually, I'm a Protoss player, so I just F2. But
Right.
you know how it is. You know what I'm saying, right? So
Theoretically, if you played a skill race, you'd need the other buttons.
yeah, if I played any skilled race, I would need the other buttons. But we all know Protoss. We just use F2.
And then
But
A key. You need the A key and the mouse, but other than that.
yeah, that's right. Um, so it was an interesting thing. And so the question, I know we have this almost every time about a book, is how do we practice?
Yeah.
How do we get better at StarCraft? Because if you just jump on the ladder, you're basically, in my opinion, I think you're just trying to play the whole musical piece in one
Right.
go.
Right.
And it's fun.
Mm-hmm.
StarCraft's fun. I like it. But is that going to get me better if I'm just trying to play the musical piece and mess around with it in one go? And I just do that again and again and again. So how do we break it down?
Right. And this is where I think maybe people getting stuck comes from, because there are kind of like you're talking about with the core, right? If you're in Bronze League, there are absolutely things that you can be deep practicing. We'll get to what deep practice is in a second here, but that's the stuff that builds the myelin is deep practice. You can be doing the right kind of practice by literally just jamming games, because it isn't about the composition you made or what your opponent did to you. You're not really fighting your opponent if you're in Bronze League. You're fighting the user interface, right? You're trying to figure out, okay, wait, where do I put my hand to like make a probe and stuff, right? How do I build a pylon? How do I, oh God, I've got, 10,000 minerals. How do I spend that, right? These really, really basic fundamental things. And at that MMR, literally throwing you in the ladder and just letting you flail around is deep practice, because the information and the game state that your opponent is generating isn't really relevant to your learning, right? You're just kind of pushing buttons and doing stuff, and you're going to get better at pushing buttons and doing stuff um, just over the course of kind of flailing around, right? But somewhere along the way, you kind of cap out at that. Like you've attained a basic competency at skills like using your hotkeys and pointing your mouse at a thing, and certainly you can get better, right? But is that the thing that's going to make you the most better, if I can say most better, per unit of time, or for your effort, right? And I think it's a diminishing returns thing, and I think that's where people get stuck, because at some point you probably have to start doing something other than just jam games. So for me, I just last night played a couple of PVTs against a person who really, really punished the hell out of my inability to react well to Widow Mine drops. And we played 2 games, we queued into each other back to back, and the person chose to do the exact same strategy because, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Um, and I knew they would do it. I had stalkers in position, but I don't have that skill yet. And that person skill checked me on that, and I failed it. Um, I can queue up a bunch of ladder games and hope that I hit a Terran, right? I can dice roll the 1 and 3 that I hit a Terran, and I can then hope that the Terran chooses a build order that allows for the game to even hit 5 minutes or whatever it is when that drop hits, and then I can hope that they choose to do that drop instead of whatever other 2 base thing they could do to me, or Mac, or whatever else it is. And now you start to think about it like, okay, if that skill is what's holding me back and keeping me at the MMR I'm at, is queuing ladder games the right thing, or should I go see if Printf has made a minute micro challenge on reacting to Widow Mines? Turns out he has. I need to practice that.
Mm-hmm.
But so I'm starting to think more along the lines of that. That's, the analogy of the musical piece of like, let me break it down and get this little chunk and just play this little piece of the song over and over and over again and see, okay, did I get it right? Okay, what do I need to correct? And rapidly iterate and figure out what those nuances are that I'm missing. So that's kind of what I'm interested in figuring out. Like there are certain skills like that one where we know how to do it, right? And maybe we could say, I do or do not like this particular implementation of the minute micro trainer or whatever, but it's something approximately that shape, right? There are other skills that I know I need to work on, such as controlling a unit on the map, but then also building stuff and maintaining my attention. I personally struggle with this in 2 places on the map. For whatever reason, that breaks my brain, and I struggle. And either the unit dies or my macro slips. But I don't know how to isolate and train that, really. Like, I've done the multitask trainer, I've done all these things that purport to solve that, and it just doesn't quite cut it, and I don't know how to fix that. But I know for sure if I could find a way to target and deep practice that, my MMR would improve, right? So these are the questions that I'm really interested in after kind of reading through this book.
Hmm. And I think we'll get to it a little bit later as well. As I think coaching can play a big
Mm,
role in this,
mm-hmm,
and I know a lot of people do get coaching in StarCraft, but there is sort of this interesting thing of most. I would say I guess I'm generalizing, but it seems like most of us are just playing the game to get better, and we're not isolating. And so it's the sort of thing like in baseball, if a hitter is having trouble, then they're going to send them to the batting cage or to batting practice
mm-hmm,
with a heavy bat, and like they're going to practice that.
mm-hmm,
And then when they get, actually at bat in a game with a lighter bat,
yep,
things feel a little bit easier, right? And so they isolate these things out. And in sports, we do this. We humans do this all the time in different sports. Um, but in StarCraft, it becomes a little bit tricky unless somebody's made a specific
mm-hmm.
trainer, or you have a practice partner that's willing to sit down and say, "Yeah, I'll bailing bust you for an hour and a half." Okay, right? And that's like pretty boring for your practice partner. But if you have somebody that does that, it's quite a really nice thing that somebody would be willing to do it. But then you can actually try to get better at it. The other thing I thought of when I read this, and as well as when you were talking, is that it seems to me that just based on the way that StarCraft is, you have these sort of brain stressing things to learn,
Mm-hmm.
and you can see them if anybody has watched lower league play. So if you go watch a gold streamer and you're in platinum, or you go watch a diamond streamer if you're in masters, or you watch masters play if you're GM, you can see the sort of wall that they're hitting. It's
Mm-hmm.
very obvious to you. Um, and as you progress up the ranks in general, you sort of like, to get out of bronze, you need to learn how to press the right buttons and what each unit does, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
basically, or even just a couple of units. To get out of silver, you need to probably learn how to expand and build workers. And in gold, okay, now it's like starting to add a tiny sprinkle of a little bit of strategy in there. And platinum is a little bit more strategy and a little bit more macro, and everything starts to come together, right? And by the time you get to diamond masters, everybody's basically macroing decently. They're not
Mm-hmm.
doing it perfectly, obviously, but they sort of fall apart when they get harassed or whatever
Mm-hmm.
it is. But it's much harder to practice those nuanced positions. Like, okay, you died to widow mines,
Mm-hmm.
and that's an issue.
Yeah.
And if you could solve that issue, then you would win a bunch more games, and
Mm-hmm.
you maybe would gain 100 MMR.
Yep.
But you don't see widow mines often enough in your games to
Mm-hmm.
really get enough practice to get against it, or it's not stressful enough to your brain in the way that you encounter it. So when you
Mm-hmm.
win a game against widow mines, it was too easy,
Yep.
or somebody messed up or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. Whereas when you're in the lower leagues, you're actually just fighting the game a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
You essentially, there's so many bronze to GM series out there on YouTube from any state of StarCraft, that we know that you can basically build one unit type for a lot of those leagues
Mm-hmm.
and just make it to the top, kind of towards master level. Um, and at those stages, what's stressing your brains is very concrete, and it becomes more abstract as you get better and better and better at StarCraft.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where a coach can come in real handy, I
Yeah,
think.
giving you the right cue to, I've definitely had this. So, fans of my stream know that I get pretty regular coaching from both Printf as well as HJax, a couple of, GM Protoss players. And many times in my games, in fact, even in those PVTs that I've been referencing, I will hear their voice in my head say some little cue, some little snippet, right? In the case of the Widow Mines, it was HJax telling me, look, it doesn't matter in Diamond if you screw up and you lose half your mineral line to those Widow Mines. If you can make workers better than your opponent you can still be in that game. And sure as shit, when I checked that replay, I was even on workers. And I'm not kidding you. This guy's dropping 4 Widow Mines in my main over and over and over. And I'm letting my probes die. Sometimes I'm pulling my probes into the Widow Mines. And I kept chrono boosting workers. And we stayed even until like, I don't know, 12, 15 minutes, something like that. And so those little cues like that, ordinarily I just get upset and GG, right? I'm like, oh, I feel sad. I lost my mineral line. I guess we're done here, right? So those little cues can be a huge boost for sure. Shout out to pig coaching, make sure you go buy some of that.
um, I want to add to that too. I remember it was quite a while ago because it was during the time that PvP was mostly an air battle with phoenixes, and it was
Mm.
in a GSL match, and I believe it was Creator versus Zest. But I watched this GSL match where basically Creator got into a fantastic early game position, was ahead, had a bunch of phoenixes. Zest did not. And Zest made a bunch of Stargates and started chrono boosting the crap out of them to get phoenixes out. And I thought, this game is done. I'm gonna go get a snack and come back
Mm-hmm.
because it's over. Creator's got this. That's great, you know. Like good for Creator, right? Good to see him take a game on Zest. And then I come back, and all of a sudden Zest has way more Phoenix than Creator, and I'm like, what in the world happened? This is if I was in that game, I would have left, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's no way to come back. Absolutely
Mm-hmm.
not. And I watched the VOD, and it turns out that Zest just chrono boosted his Phoenixes better than Creator, right? And like Creator had more Phoenixes and was still making them, and Zest got more out after a few minutes than Creator had just by using Chrono Boost better. And so there was a skill gap there for the
Mm-hmm.
two of them. And it really was like a valuable lesson in StarCraft. It was like, wow, like you really shouldn't give up these games where you think you're just totally down and out until like, you know, you don't have to fantasy GG it, but like
Mm-hmm.
until you're beaten, really beaten, like you have no army left and you have like a few work, you know, like you really should play it out if you want to truly want to try and win. And also like those can be valuable learning experiences for you as kind of tough as those positions can be and you
Mm-hmm.
still lose and you still feel bad about it, right? Because this is one thing that we all experience as StarCraft players, like losing really hurts. Like we
Mm-hmm.
don't like to lose. It's like, oh, I just get angry or I get sad or I get depressed or whatever it is that your emotional status will be. But you can still learn a lot from those positions. So that was kind of an interesting thing. And I think goes right along with your Widowmine experience.
Yeah, I think with that, it depends what you're targeting. If you are trying to be a tournament player, absolutely, you are pretty much required to stay in those games and learn those weird situations. If you are trying to do targeted practice for specific things, and you didn't hold that two base tank push at your third or whatever in a PVT, I am 100% okay with somebody GGing and queuing again to try to find another tank push like that so they can try to hold it. And I take a lot of flack from chat on stream for GGing out of games when I'm doing this type of targeted practice. And I think that it's something people have a pretty big misconception about, right? So if you're targeting one skill, it makes sense to GG. If you're trying to target, so I spent a couple of months working on what I called emotional resilience, right? Which is the not being mentally beaten when you aren't actually beaten in the game state. And I think we've all experienced this too. Mutas do this to me like nothing else. Like if I have to chase a bunch of damn mutalisks from base to base to base, and it doesn't matter that I only lost like 2 probes or whatever it was as they're flying from base to base, like eventually I just feel so beat up inside that I'm like over it, right? And the game state could be totally fine, but I am emotionally depleted. People have this with mech play as well, right? People don't like to play drawn out games against mech. Um, if that's what you're trying to work on, then yeah, stay in the game. If you're trying to hold some early, timing push that's really popular build order on the ladder right now, then maybe GG out and try to find another person to do that to you. But I guess the point here that I'm driving at is be intentional with it. Don't just let your mood that day be driving your GG timing. Choose it based on what you're trying to target, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we've
Yeah.
been talking about deep practice, but we haven't actually defined it. Do you
Yeah.
want to take a stab at that? If not, I can try to do it.
Yeah, I'll let you do it. I'll
Okay,
let you do
sure.
it if you have it in mind.
So I don't have the exact excerpt out of the book. I tried to flip the only thing that I could find was deep practice is a powerful idea because it seems magical, and then it references this anecdote about a musician named Clarissa. It's a very famous video clip, I guess, in neuroscience, where this young girl is practicing a piece, and she's not a particularly talented musician, and she does something kind of interesting. There's some spark that changes how she's practicing in the middle of the video. And she starts kind of playing this piece, and she'll play through it a little bit, and she'll screw up a little piece, and then she'll stop, and then she'll go back and try to get that piece right, and she'll screw up again, and she'll stop and go back. And she kept kind of interrupting herself, and it's these little like fits and starts, but if you watch it, and I haven't seen it, I'm interested to. I think there is a link in the footnotes somewhere.
I think, yeah, in the end of the book, yeah.
Um, but supposedly, if you watch it, you kind of see the piece kind of coalesce. You're like, and this is sort of the holy shit experience in a way, right? Where you're like, what is happening here, right? Like this person has had this burst of skill where all of a sudden she can play this piece, and it's not quite clear why, right? So that's what we're trying to get to. We're trying to figure out how do you chop StarCraft up into these little pieces. And when I was reading that about Clarissa, the musician in the study, it reminded me of when I was in Silver, Gold, Plat League, and I would do this like build order practice stuff, and I would look at my replays and break it down and be like, okay, you're screwing up this pylon. Go do the build order, get that pylon right. And I would do this in my room off stream alone, and my girlfriend would hear me swearing from all the way out in the living room, and I would GG out immediately when I missed the damn pylon again, right? And I would just go through it and go through it and go through it. And lo and behold, I'd go on ladder and I'd rip people apart because I just had more stuff. And I didn't know how to take a fight properly until HX taught me it in like Diamond 3, right? I just had
Mm.
so much more that I would like move command my stuff through their army and then eventually attack and like just have so much more that you can win. Um, so again, the question for me is how do you do it with more kind of fuzzy skills or skills that are harder to isolate or that you can't isolate alone? Is that innate in the problem of StarCraft at a high level, or is this something that we can fix, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
if it's fixable, we need to get on that, right? I need to go learn how to edit maps or whatever it's going to be, or we need to, have a Discord of people who are willing to trade time doing a certain build against each other or resume from replay is another good example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Take that PVT, resume it from 4 minutes 30, and then let the person drop me at 5 minutes and see, and let's just do that. And yeah, it sucks because it's really slow, but maybe that is our best bet, right?
Yeah, and I think your stream, and I know that the format was uh, sort of adapted from Maynard.
Yeah.
But doing this deliberate practice and having a focus goal, I think, gets at this problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where if you say, regardless of the game state outcome, I want to be scouting with a hallucinated phoenix
Mm-hmm.
at 5 minutes 30 seconds, and
Mm-hmm.
if I can do that, that's a win for me.
Yep.
And that actually does attack this problem in I think a really effective way, and it's probably why your progression up to diamond was rather quick
Mm.
in a lot of ways. And obviously everybody grows differently in StarCraft,
Mm-hmm.
but I remember watching you get better at StarCraft through your stream, and I was really impressed at skill improvements.
Mm-hmm.
That there were times that you weren't macroing, and then I'd come back. I don't catch your stream all the time because you're on the West Coast and I'm on
Mm-hmm.
the East Coast time, but come back after a while, and all of a sudden I'm like, whoa, where did all this macro skill come from? It's like, not missing pylons or supply depots or whatever it is you were doing, and
Mm-hmm.
you were just nailing it. And it was
Mm-hmm.
like, wow, okay, the really big jump in skill. And I think that sort of style of deliberate practice is really important. And there are a few StarCraft streamers that do this, right? There are a number of them out there,
Mm-hmm.
but I think a lot of pros hide what they do, right? They don't want other people to know.
Sure.
It's
Yeah.
for their own best interest to be good at the game and also have some secrets about how they're getting good and what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about it before, but boy, would I like to know what Cyril's practice routine
Mm-hmm.
is and has been,
Yeah.
or what Rainer's practice routine is and has been.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these players, like, what does Morrow do? What is the skill set? They're like, how did he develop that skill set? What did he do in the past? What is he
Mm-hmm.
doing now? And that to me would be really interesting, because I wonder how they chop up the game. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe if you're that good, you have just a number of practice partners that are willing to just hang out with you,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't have to worry about it. But still, it's a very interesting thing. And I think if you don't have that luxury,
Mm-hmm.
deliberate practice is definitely a good way to go to get deliberate practice to get into deep practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I like it.
So, shall we move on to the thing that is probably nearly as important as practice is in the way emphasized in the book?
Yes,
And
and I didn't put it in the show notes, but after we've introduced this topic, I do have an anecdote to add to this one.
All right. So the next section that we'll talk about is basically motivation, or as it's called in the book, ignition. So this is like a really high level of motivation to make you do stuff. Whatever the
Mm-hmm.
thing is you want to get better at, you need to have motivation. And this is like pretty obvious when you think about it, right? If you're not motivated, you're not going to do it, right? If you've ever tried to teach a kid any skill or any academic endeavor
Mm-hmm.
and they don't want to do it, you might as well not even be teaching them because they're
Yep.
not going to get anything out of it. The motivation is so very important in learning and in acquiring new skills that you have to be able to get that down
Mm-hmm.
before you're going to get any practice. So if you're struggling to get yourself to play StarCraft, you need to work on that motivation
Mm-hmm.
first, because it's just going to be so tedious and you're not going to get there. And you see this, or at least I've seen this over the years with different sports I've done. I teach scuba diving, so like I've seen it with scuba diving, I've seen it with exercising, I've seen it with all sorts of things at the university level where I work. Um, I see it a lot where people are doing things because they know it's something they should do or it's good for them,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't have the motivation to either keep it going or to do it in a way that they will enjoy it and actually learn from it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the stereotypical, it's January 1st. I made a New Year's resolution to start running. So I'm going to
Yep.
start running. And after about 4 or 5 days, there's no more running
Mm-hmm.
because there was really no motivation there other than, I made this resolution that I really should keep and it's
Mm-hmm.
really good for me. And they don't like it, or the person, hates it or whatever, that you're not going to do it. And this is why you also hear from medical doctors that when somebody says, well, what's the best exercise routine I can do?
Mm-hmm.
The one you will follow and the
Yep.
one you will do consistently.
Yep.
It doesn't matter. Any exercise is good if you can do it consistently. And
Mm-hmm.
this is the same thing. And we'll talk about some ways that this can be developed. But I found it's so obvious, but I never really conceptualized it in words before. And then it's like, oh, of course, this book has it in there.
Right. Yeah, yeah, it's interesting, right? So the note that I had here was we have this like lost passion meme in StarCraft, right? People when they're down on themselves or whatever will be like, oh, I lost my passion, or people will give other people a hard time, saying, oh, so and so lost their passion, they're not in the game. So like the fact that we have immortalized it, it's like part of the meme fabric of the game culture, right? To me, that signifies that there is a real tangible thing there that a lot of people struggle with. And I guess, to go back a little bit to my, advocating being a quitter that I was doing earlier, right? If what it's going to take for you to not, tilt wildly out of your practice session and be really mad or sad is to GG out when you see that mech player and you just, you've absolutely had it against mech this week and you don't want to do it. If playing that mech game is going to result in the same net MMR loss as quitting right now, and then also you're not going to queue games for the next hour, just GG and move on to practicing whatever you were trying to practice, because this person isn't going to give you the thing that you're trying to target, right? On the other hand, if you're trying to work on emotional resilience, again, do that. But so that's one thing where, we're going to talk about ignition, which is how do I kindle the passion. I think not losing it is also really important too. And this can take a lot of forms. The one that I gave is just one example. Something that Coach H. Jacks and I have talked often about is he struggles a lot with this, the ignition part. He's got the skill and he's got, the sort of mental desire, I guess, to want to continue to improve, right? He's in GM, but he would obviously like to be better. And, he just streamed the other day and all of his friends were giving him a hard time because the stream title was de-resting, and the last like 10 times he streamed, the stream title was also de-resting, right? Because it's like that's however often he can get the oomph to do it. And it's not because he doesn't love the game. I talk to him about the game all the time. He's watching, GSL, he's reviewing tournament replays, all this stuff. But for some reason, that ignition piece just isn't there for him right now. And so he would rather go and work on his StarCraft AI. Again, still being like a huge important part of the hobby, but that ignition piece for him in his training is missing right now. He doesn't know how to fix it, even though he wants to. So luckily, the book talks a little bit about this.
Yeah, and I definitely, I mean, I think all of us StarCraft players can relate to this, right? Because unless you're a professional that plays StarCraft every day, or maybe you're
Mm-hmm.
streamers that can support yourself by playing StarCraft every day, there is going to be something that will interfere with your ability to practice. It's there's life gets in the way. Even this just happened to Neuro, right? Neuro moved to a new
Mm-hmm.
location
Mm-hmm.
and didn't have a chance to stream for a while, didn't have a chance to play for a while, and had a sort of, quote unquote derusting stream,
Mm-hmm.
right? And was just getting back at it and losing games and learning from it. And I think if there's anybody in the community, which we are lucky to have, and we're lucky to have a lot of people in
Yeah.
StarCraft, but one of the people that we're very lucky to have is Neuro,
Mm-hmm.
and his mental attitude and his mental fortitude towards uh, getting better at a game.
Mm-hmm.
And it's if you watch again, I'll do the Counter-Strike reference because I do watch the Counter-Strike. So if you know who the War Owl is, you'll know that one of the catchphrases that he says is that Counter-Strike is not a game that gets easier for you because your character gets better. You get better, so the
Mm-hmm.
game gets easier.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same way in StarCraft, right? Like it's all about your attitude just as much as your attitude as what your APM is and
Mm-hmm.
what your hands are doing. And this is it's a really interesting thing about the motivation. And I think Eric's really hit the nail on the head that if you're getting tilted, then that's not helping. It's actually just as bad as building a bad habit,
Mm-hmm.
because tilting and then like, begrudgingly playing more games is damaging your motivation,
Mm-hmm.
and you're not having fun. And so it's like, how do you avoid the tilt? And like, like deliberate practice is one way to do it. Focus goals are one way to do it. There's a story in the book about baseball, and it's about Curacao versus Aruba,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of Aruba and Curacao are these sort of Caribbean island nations that used to be Dutch colonies, and they both like baseball, but Curacao has like way more people that are much better at baseball. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, they're sending their kids to win the Little League World Series, whereas Aruba is like, they're good, but it's not Curacao, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about the motivation that the kids and the people on Curacao, they live baseball, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is everywhere around them, and everybody is motivated to do it, and it's just like part of their culture.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Aruba, it's something they do and they're good at, but it's not part of their culture. And so this is sort of the beginning, the way that this was framed in the book was beginning to create your own sort of motivation for your skill.
Mm-hmm.
And how can you get good at something by keeping that motivation up?
Mm-hmm. So we have an excerpt coming up. Looks like.
Yeah, so this the next part that I put in here, I got 3 of them, and we don't have to talk about them all in great length, but um, there's this sort of part in the book that he talks about the Z boys,
Mm-hmm.
right? So these are skateboard kids that were skateboarding in like the 70s and 80s, I believe,
Mm-hmm.
and they were sort of surfers that lived in Southern California, and they were creating the skateboard scene and
Mm-hmm.
really advancing it. And I don't even need to read the book for this one,
Mm-hmm.
because what it basically was is that when these kids were met by a coach, so this older guy who was into surfing and skateboarding, and he was sort of taking them under his wing to keep them out of trouble, but also give them motivation to like enter competitions and things.
Mm-hmm.
There was a surf competition, and these young boys were going against like guys who were really good at surfing, but they were adults. And basically, the coach goes over and says to one of the top guys in the competition that he's like, "You can't hang," and I forget the kid's name, but it's like a 13-year-old or something. There's no way you're going to hang with this 13-year-old. And he says it so that the 13-year-old overhears it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And basically saying he has complete faith that this kid's going to crush you.
Yep.
He's going to do whatever it is out on the waves that I have no idea what windsurf competitions other than like you can do flips and stuff, but like he's going to do something out there that you will not be able to hang with.
Mm-hmm.
And the kid goes on to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was that the seed was laid. It wasn't that the coach went over to the kid and was like, okay, you can do this, you're the best,
Yeah.
he laid the foundation of, I believe in you, but not directly addressing
Mm-hmm.
him. And I thought it was such a really cool story because it sort of it sets up this idea of hard work gives results.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you put the effort in, you get the results. Um, and these kids rose to the occasion, which is really important, I think, in terms of motivation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. Like that story stuck out to me as well. I think the quote, for whatever reason my brain remembers stuff like this. He walks up to the guy and says, "Don't even worry about it, man. You don't have a chance."
Yeah.
And it's this just little soundbite, right? But done in the right way with, I'm sure he had to like method act that in a sense. Like he had to really believe that, but also deliver it in a way that was like a nonchalant statement of fact, right? Like he had to internalize it and then externalize it as though it's just a thing he knew was the case, and then let it be overheard. And the kid's like, "Oh, this is this is what he thinks of me after months and months of us grinding together and him observing me, that this guy's going to get destroyed. Oh, okay. Well, I don't feel nervous anymore, right?" Because if you give the kid the pep talk you're talking about, all of a sudden it's like, "Oh shit, I hope I can live up to what coach is telling me," and blah 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 and all this stuff. Like I
You
am
put all
that.
that pressure on them, right?
Yeah, yeah, and like as a nervous person, I relate to that a lot. Like that would absolutely make me lose the competition, right? But the other thing might work, right? Like I can't totally put myself in that kid's shoes, but like I can see why it would work, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things that the book definitely, it doesn't say explicitly, but it's pretty obvious as it goes through the stories, is that
Mm-hmm.
there are different ways to do different things,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no one size fits all method to get good.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to get good at skill X, you might have a different set of practice routines or coaching guidelines or motivations than the person sitting next to you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just going to be the way it is with human brains.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in this case, that's what the kid needed to hear to go crush it,
Right.
and just shred away. If you shredded the gnar the whole way down, right? That's how they say it in California.
I think
You
so,
shred the
yeah.
gnar.
I live a little bit inland, so it's a little bit harder for me to, the dialect
Oh,
is
okay.
different in here.
You're not shredding the gnar.
Not as I have to drive like 20 minutes.
Oh man, that's so far.
Yeah, brutal. Just 20 minutes to get to the beach, right? What a hard life.
So, so to compare that, there's another story about this KIPP school,
Mm-hmm.
and this is a program that was started. I think they started in Texas, but they were also doing it in the Bronx, maybe, or somewhere
Some
in
inner city scenario. I forget where exactly, but yeah.
yeah, I think it was New York, but I don't remember which. So somewhere up in New York, and it was like aimed at poor, underprivileged children, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And it basically didn't work for a few years until they started integrating this idea of ignition and motivation.
Mm-hmm.
And then it just blew up, and they were getting test scores that were unbelievably high. They were taking kids that basically were way behind in reading and math and all their English skills, and taking them, pushing them beyond,
Mm-hmm.
beyond what the average was for their grade level, and
Mm-hmm.
even above that. And so the author actually goes to one of these schools and kind of, does like a just observation of the way that schools run. And it's literally, when I read it, I was like, what? Right? The children have to line up a certain way. They have to wear a certain uniform. They have to hold their hands a certain way. They have to
Mm-hmm.
hold their books a certain way. When they work, in groups, they do a certain thing. And there's this like extreme rigor in
Yeah.
the way that they've designed that school, which apparently for teaching inner city poor children works.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that they emphasize, or he emphasizes in the book, that happens in the classroom is that the new kids, like, I don't know, first or second graders, but they were young kids,
Mm-hmm.
they go into their class, they have no desks and no chairs, and they have
Mm-hmm.
to sit on the floor. And the teacher tells them, you haven't earned your desks and chairs yet. I think that's such a fantastic and interesting way to
Mm-hmm.
motivate, so the children are also told that they're all going to go to college, and
Mm-hmm.
they are repeatedly told they're all going
Yeah.
to go to college. So they have this goal in mind.
Mm-hmm.
But when they get to their classroom, they have this goal. I'm going to get to college, but I don't even have a desk. I don't even have a chair.
Yeah.
Right. And I have to work to get those things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes very clear
Mm.
that working is the way to get to college. Working hard is the way to
Interesting.
get to college, and working hard is the way to get to achieve that goal. And so and then it makes sense to me why there's this high rigor and this very military-esque style. And I've always been interested in the Navy SEALs just in general as
Mm-hmm.
an organization. I think it's very interesting,
Mm-hmm.
and there are a number of books I've read and podcasts I've listened to and interviews and so on, and they do this in the special ops and the highest level of the military where they are always, it's very clear that they have a goal and they have to work towards that goal, and people
Mm-hmm.
don't just make it, right? And if you've
Mm-hmm.
listened to any of these interviews or read any of the interviews about people who've made it through to become a Navy SEAL, that in their buds training, in their selection training, the guys who are actually really fit and look like they should make it are often the ones that quit,
Right.
because they come in thinking that they've got it, their motivation isn't there, and it's going to be easy or whatever, and they're actually totally fit enough to do it, but they just mentally haven't prepared themselves in the right way. And then the people who have the fortitude to make it through, of course you have to be obviously very fit to do that, there's no doubt about it, but they have the fortitude that will carry them through, and they just don't say no, they don't quit,
Mm-hmm.
they never stop. And
Right.
that is an interesting thing, and I think this school embodies this sort of military idea of there's a high level of rigor and you have to work extremely hard, but if you do that you will achieve greatness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting you made that connection. When I read that part of the book, I didn't totally get, like, okay, so there's all this rigor, right? And there's all this, strict harshness of rules. Like literally, you're holding your binder at the wrong angle, and until you fix it, none of us are doing anything, right? And
Right.
I'm like, this is a little much, right?
It's
Um,
like children, right?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Why? And like the clapping and the chants and all, like, are we in a cult right now? Like, what the hell is
Yeah.
going on? But when you frame it as not making the kid earn their desk because they don't deserve the desk. See, that's how I internalized it at first. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but rather setting up a scenario where something sucks and I want it not to suck. And the way that I can do that is effort, right? And then you tickle the reward center in my brain because I applied effort and I got the thing to not suck anymore and I got the result I wanted. Um, that starts to feel pretty good, right? It sets up the dynamic for the kid of, this is how stuff goes. I didn't realize, I didn't realize that if I just worked at stuff, I could improve my life, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I obviously, like, I have to extrapolate a lot, right? Because I came from a much, much more privileged background than the kids that are attending these schools, right? I had so much more. But I've read about these scenarios, and I've watched interviews and that kind of thing with people who come from these backgrounds who have struggled through that and found some way to kind of make it. Excuse me 1 second, sorry. And the big thing that I've taken from listening to others, right, attentively listening to people who do come from backgrounds like this, is that um, being told something like you are going to go to college, right? Because that is the other component here at the KIPP school.
Yeah.
Is that is something that a lot of these kids have never heard, right? And so I think it's not just, oh, the strict, like, you're gonna do these things and whatever, but rather the combination of applying effort gets me things I want, and being just hit over the head over and over and over again with, you can do this, all of you are going to college, and kind of some interaction between those two things is, I think, at least what's making this work. What I thought before with all the strictness was that it was just to make the kids not be assholes to each other, which it does
Mm-hmm.
do that too, right? They specifically call that out of, like, if somebody, they had some tiny example of rudeness. I forget what it was, but it was like very minor, right? Especially for like a rough and tumble, like, inner city situation.
Yeah.
And they flat out stop the entire class and handle that, and they go, no, we don't do that here. So I think it's maybe the interaction between those kind of 3 points of the triangle of, like, not losing time and derailing the class over bad behavior because you invest so heavily in completely stomping out its existence, developing that effort reward thing, and then just reiterating over and over and over, you are doing this, this is an option for you, I know you've never heard this before, but this is how it's going to go, you're going to college, and they all do. and I really think it's an amazing program, one that I never heard of before, but really really cool.
Yeah, I think I'd heard of it before. One of the things to add on to exactly what you're saying,
Mm-hmm.
and that I'm not a military or ex-military person, but I know I've heard stories like this being true. Is that there are cases where, like for example, during certain training of groups in the military, let's say they have some drill like reassemble your rifle, and one of the guys can't do it fast enough.
Mm.
Well, they'll make the officer in charge of that platoon start doing push-ups while the guy who's trying to assemble the rifle
Mm-hmm.
or whatever it is trying to figure it out. And I know that I've heard this before, is that what happens is then the whole platoon will join the officer in doing the push-ups, right, to show
Mm-hmm.
unity within the group. And so it's that sort of attitude, right, in the school program, is that like one person acts up, nope, everybody stops, we're going to
Mm-hmm.
solve this problem, right,
Mm-hmm.
because we're in this together. And that's a really interesting thing. Like we don't have that really group dynamic in Starcraft, because it's basically team games are not that popular.
Mm-hmm.
I know I play them too, but like really they're not that popular. 1v1 is where the competitive action is at. But you could see that for other video games, right? So Counter-Strike would be like that, League of Legends,
Mm-hmm.
Dota, anything you have a team dynamic there, that the team has to look out for each other and the team
Mm-hmm.
has to work together. And so this is one aspect of how to grow together as a team that is really important. And I thought it was super cool
Mm-hmm.
in the book to see that. So maybe with that, we should move on to, because getting close to where we want
Yeah.
to wrap up and answer questions. Coaching,
Yeah.
because the
Um,
last part of the book is about coaching.
Yeah, so we kind of touched on coaching already a little bit, and Adraseth pointed out this concept of, who a person is and what their traits are like may impact the kind of coaching they need. Somebody like me, who's a little harder on themselves and, prone to kind of ruminate or get really anxious, that person might need a different kind of coach than somebody who maybe isn't super motivated but has a lot of potential or, whatever, different stuff. There is a distinction between that and the subject matter requiring different coaching, right? So whether playing violin or playing StarCraft or playing soccer require different styles of coaching. And the book kind of asserts the claim that these different. Let me back up. I fully accept the notion that different people require different styles of coaching. The book gives a number of really good examples of that I completely buy. But he also puts forward the notion that these different problem domains require a different type of coaching or different input. And I haven't made up my mind, but I wanted to just pose the question of, do we buy this? Because to me, it runs directly counter to everything that Josh Waitzkin said in our last episode with Printf, where he's looking at things as disparate as chess and martial arts and saying this is the exact same shit. Like for him as a competitor, right? In his head, it is completely indistinguishable whether he is at the push hands championship or the world chess championship. He's playing
Right.
the same game. And so I just kind of wanted to pose the question, maybe get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so it's I found this really interesting, and we'll get into a bit of like the flexibility and consistent skills thing too, because I I immediately thought of Josh Waitzkin. So our last book, for those of you who are, if this is your first episode listening to us, our last episode we talked about The Art of Learning, written by Josh Waitzkin, who is a junior chess grandmaster all the way up into under 21. I think just over 21, he kind of stopped playing chess as seriously and went into Tai Chi. And then, I mean, it was kind of incredible story, because he just decides he wants to go win the world championship in Tai Chi and does it,
Yeah.
which is incredible. I love the story. But there is this idea of like, is a skill, and this is also like in the future, there's a book called Range, which we would love to do, that talks about this sort of thing. But is a skill sort of defined with enough rules that you can learn it in a certain way? And if you get the skill set to learn that skill, it's going to sound weird, but like if you get the art of learning down, can you just apply it to something else? And that's what Josh effectively has done, right? There's a lot of caveats to that, right? Because Josh had many different coaches, and lots of years and lots of time
Mm-hmm.
to work on just chess, as well as once he had kind of financially supported himself in a way that he could just focus on Tai Chi. But regardless, very interesting how that all has turned out. And I think I think what's it's difficult for me to say directly for Starcraft because I've never had a coach. I've
Mm-hmm.
just done it on my own. The most I could say I've had a coach is I've had a couple of GMs here and there answer a few questions for me, either in stream chat or Discord or whatnot. But
Mm-hmm.
I've never sat down with a coach and worked on it. Um, but I do have an anecdote, and that is that there was a player recently I was talking to who's GM in all three races. Guitar Cheese, go follow his stream. He's a cool guy. And I asked him, like, did you play any RTSs before? No, not really. Okay. Did you play chess? Yeah, I kind of knew it, but I didn't really play it much. And I was like, okay, well, how many games did it take you to get to GM? Oh, about 3,000. How'd that happen?
Yeah.
And he wrote back, oh, I just got it. I don't know. And then I said, well, did you play any musical instruments? Yes, I
Mm-hmm.
played a ton of piano. I
Mm-hmm.
practiced piano every day for 45 minutes or whatever it was. It was a lot of
Mm-hmm.
piano. And for me, that was like, okay, there's the connection,
Yeah.
right? There was piano lessons, there was
Mm-hmm.
piano teaching, there was many, many, many years of it.
Yep.
And it became a skill that at some point, whether it was actually the skill of playing piano
Mm-hmm.
or it was the skill set of learning
Right.
that easily applied to StarCraft.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's like, I mean, that's kind of Josh's dig in that book, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that you're applying the skill set to something else. And how can you do that through visualization, through
Yep.
meditation, through focusing, and these sort of things. And I think that effective coaches should try to identify that, right? I don't know that they do,
Right.
but I
Right.
think they
Right.
should, right? So if they get a new student, an effective coach, in my opinion, should start delving into like, okay, what's the history of this person?
Mm-hmm.
What things have you done that are similar to this? Where can
Yeah.
we build? Where do we fix bad habits?
Mm-hmm.
Rather than let's just jump in and see how you play a game of PVT or
Mm-hmm.
ZVT,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. I know that Pig does a lot of that when he so I actually tried to hire him, and then the timing didn't work out because he was on vacation. Then right after that, I was on vacation. And then my life blew up. But maybe someday soon, the Pig Eric coaching stream will happen. Um, but when you sign up for Pig coaching, there is literally a survey. Like there's a Google Doc, and you fill out a giant ass thing of questions about what are you struggling with. Like he gets all of that background. And I think that's why he's an effective coach. Again, I'm going to plug him again because he was nice enough to rate us. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, absolutely. Like I don't know why I've never thought of that before, but that completely makes sense to me. There was some other point you made that I wanted to comment on, and it's eluding me now.
Well, I can add to the Pig thing because I know I've listened to enough of Pig and
Mm-hmm.
watched enough of his YouTube videos and such, especially coaching ones.
Mm.
And I remember some point somewhere he talked about early coaching where he didn't charge much money and he would
Mm.
spend all this extra time with people, and he felt that he really needed to go way above and beyond um, what was being paid for, and really was like underselling himself with
Mm.
his coaching. But I think probably all the years of experience
Yeah.
of coaching has led him up to a point where he's super effective
Mm-hmm.
in doing that, right? Identifying those sort of parts of somebody's existing skill set or existing mentality, right? There's so many parts to it, right? Like a good coach has to deal with, how do I motivate?
Yeah.
How do I improve skills?
Mm-hmm.
What skills how do I identify problems?
Right.
How do I convince somebody if they,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes people are stubborn too,
Yeah.
right? Like, no, that's not a problem, right? How do you convince them that that's a
Mm-hmm.
problem and like start to work on it? Um, it's very interesting. There's a story in the book about this football coach who's worked with Tom Brady and is American football, worked with Tom Brady, really, really famous quarterback, if you don't know American football. And he is working with a new rookie that's going to be going to the NFL. And one of the first things he does is gets real serious and says, well, there's one thing that you got to do for me. If you don't do that, I'm going to walk out, or whatever he says. And the guy's like, well, what is it? And he's like, I want an autograph for my grandson. And it was just to break the ice to
Yeah.
get that rapport with the person, because if the person had, he seemed like he was kind of standoffish. And if he had this wall up, there was no way that
Yeah.
that information could be transferred to him. And so that's a really interesting thing about that you said about Peg having the survey of getting to know the
Mm-hmm.
player and really getting into the mentality of the
Yep.
player. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, not only do you have to be able to do all of those skill sets, but you have to figure out which ones are going to be important for that person and instantly prioritize amongst them. Like in this case, the guy just meets him, he never talked to him before, instantly does the diagnosis, instantly writes the prescription, and then enacts it perfectly and like has this, really successful coaching session with the dude. Like just
Yeah.
really, really interesting for that anyone could be that good at that. I remembered the anecdote. It was the guitar cheese thing. Um, so I had heard of Guitar Cheese. I hadn't really checked his stream out, but when he like really seriously relaunched and kind of came back to the game full bore, I found out about that through Neuro. And Neuro's comment, it's really funny because it exactly mirrored what you just said about Guitar Cheese. He didn't go into why because they hadn't had that same conversation, but Neuro said you should check out this guy's stream more than anyone else I've ever encountered in the community. He just gets the game in a certain way, like without seeming to have to try very hard. He just has a very good intuitive sense of the game. And I bet you it is that. He has the meta skill of how to learn stuff. So he's able to just be like, sure, I can BGM as all three races, whatever. It's not like that hard for me.
Yeah.
I know how to learn stuff.
Another person like that I was talking about last night on stream was Beastie Cutie.
Mm.
And not that long ago, and I actually don't know the exact history because I don't watch Beastie Cutie's stream that much,
Mm-hmm.
but I think he's a fantastic personality and got great content. But he mentioned on the Pylon show, I believe, that he was getting into Brood War and he's playing Brood War. And I thought, oh, that's cool. I like Brood War, and I'd love to get better at Brood War because it's insanely hard to
Yeah.
practice Brood War. There's a lot of reasons why, but I'm not going to get into the which game is better argument. However, I went and watched, I think, a YouTube video of him playing some Brood War, and I was like, wow, okay, it's cool. He's high APM and like doing all this cool stuff. And then wins a game and it goes to the score screen and I see he's like rank S and I'm like, holy crap.
Mm-hmm.
Like he got to rank S and either didn't have a lot of experience or just didn't play it a lot or whatever, but made it to a very, very high level of Brood War playing, right? Like to get to rank S in Brood War is good, right? It's a very good skill level. And it was super impressive. And it makes sense though, because he's one of these guys that's GM in all three races, has played a lot of StarCraft 2, either has some previous experience with Brood War or some skills that translate over, but understands how to learn and apply it. And that's why he can just seamlessly transition over to this other game. It's just similar, but be good at it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess this is something that not everybody learns, right? Like I didn't learn this. I'm still to this day learning more about how to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really interesting and great. And I love doing that. And I guess kind of end this thought, and this is sort of towards the end of the book here, is that there's this comparison of like football to playing an instrument, sort of, right? So like football, soccer, the coaches in Brazil were letting the kids play this futsal, which is like this sort of miniature football game that's a little bit different with a heavier ball and all this, but it gave them a lot of fundamental skills that they could easily translate to soccer or football. And the coaches just let them play. They didn't really interrupt them. They just let them play. They let them do their thing. They obviously every so often would give them some pointers, but they just let them play. Whereas in the musical realm, when they're playing an instrument, it was, no, that's wrong, stop. Okay, do it again. No, hold your arm like this. No, the violin, you need to hold it this way, and the bow has to be like this. No, stop, do it again. And the whole difference was that with musical playing, there is basically one right way to do it. Like if you're playing a classical piece, you have to play an A minor. When the A minor comes up, you can't play anything else there. You have to be in this key for this measure. You can't be off beat here. You have to rest there. Those sort of things are like, you must do them. And there are obviously rules in football, but the flexibility of the rules is such that there's a lot more space for people to come up with ways to play. And this is the big shout out to Florencio here, or Printef, or some of these guys that play StarCraft in, quote, not the right way. And right, like go watch Florencio's stream or watch the Florencio 5, freaking hilarious. But like he wins games against players that are good. They're good players, right? They're like masters and GM players like routinely wins games against those kind of people doing stuff that just makes your brain explode,
He
right?
takes
Like,
heat for
why
it
is this
too.
work?
Like,
Yeah,
people do not like that he wins some of those games.
yeah, he takes heat for it all over the community. And so it's really, I think it's really interesting. And I don't know the answer. Like, ultimately, I couldn't come up with the right answer in my head whether or not StarCraft is more like music and that there's a right way to
Uh,
play it, or more like football and then there's many right ways to do it. I probably would lean towards it's more like football.
mm-hmm.
But then is it that the fundamental skills must be done in a certain way? I don't know. I don't know. And this is something we can discuss and further talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But open it up to everybody in chat. If you have questions, add us so we see it and let loose, and we'll answer your questions and whatever comments you want to add. Um, I know there's a ton of stuff that's gone by in the chat that was
Yeah,
really
yeah,
good. And I
yeah.
was trying to keep up with it, but I've forgotten already
Same,
some of
yeah.
it. So
I will comment just kind of while we're waiting for folks to chime in. I initially posed the question of do we buy this, you know, you have to coach a certain way for a certain skill, and I think you sold me on it at least for music, right? Where literally, if you don't play the right note, it isn't like a little bit wrong. It's you just aren't playing the song anymore, right? Um, and I think that's a really interesting lens to put onto StarCraft too. Like in addition to just selling me on this notion that maybe in some cases you do need to coach differently. Um, the way that I was thinking about it was in kind of back to like the StarCraft 2 AI stuff, right? All the machine learning, deep mind stuff that recently happened. One of the things that they talked about was StarCraft being interesting because there's sort of discrete um, steps that you can take in chess, right? Which is kind of like or Go, which are kind of the games that have been tackled in the past. You either are on this square or on this one. But in StarCraft, it is a continuous space, right?
mm-hmm.
So literally just the movement of a unit is like orders of magnitude more complicated than it would be in those other games, right? So I for whatever reason that was the analogy that surfaced in my head as you were talking about the difference between, football or soccer and and playing music, right? In music, you're either playing the note or you're not. But if my foot contacts the ball here or there, right, a millimeter difference, how substantially does that impact my kick, right? I mean, obviously, physics tells us somewhat, right? But maybe there are a couple of slightly different but equally acceptable ways to kick that ball, right? And maybe
Yeah.
it depends on my musculature and, the kinetics of my body and whatever. So I almost think the StarCraft analogy would be, if you're playing the wrong note, that's like I tried to hit a key on my keyboard and I didn't make it, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
my brain was trying to say warp in these adepts and that didn't happen, right? Obviously, that's a complete non starter. But outside of that, maybe it does look a lot more like soccer coaching, right? Because there is a
Mm-hmm.
little bit more of that sort of, again, like a continuous space of how are you allocating your attention? What sort of decisions are you making? This kind of thing. So Captain Hoppa in chat. By the way, I've been seeing you in chat. Thank you for checking us out. I really appreciate having you. Could we mold Alpha Star to think the same way that Florencio does? I love it. I okay. I do
You just
have.
got to give it, if you give it Florencio replays, right? It's what you input there.
It's an interesting angle. So I will say, Captain Hop, I do have a computer science background. Machine learning is not my specialty, but in my professional opinion, if you were to do that, it would blow the computer up. That's just what I think would happen.
We just start on fire immediately.
Yeah, you would have to start from scratch. I think you wouldn't have a computer anymore.
Let's there's a couple of comments about the military a little further up, and I'll just read them out because we're not getting a huge number of questions.
Sure.
um, so deep before dishonor says training the military is not what it used to be. The strength and the mental stability and cohesion and unit cohesiveness is not trained in the military like it used to be.
Hmm.
It's still there, but it's not like it used to be in many areas of the military now.
Hmm.
Um, And Chris BK says, I think the Navy SEAL training is intended to develop the willingness to help the soldier on your left and the soldier on your right, regardless how much pain you're experiencing. What makes them great is the knowledge that every SEAL is looking out for each other.
Mm.
So I think this is like, coming back to that sort of cohesiveness, which we don't really have in StarCraft, but still I find interesting, and I think other do find interesting, is that, if you're in a group and you're in an organization, you want to make that organization stronger. One of the ways to do that is to make people care about each other and to work together. And that's like what they were doing in that KIP school.
Yeah, foxhole syndrome, right? You care about the person in the foxhole next to you. So I gave kind of a meme answer to the machine learning question, but again, this is not my specialty. So somebody who's like a hardcore, ML enthusiast, even doing it nights and weekends, will, be screaming right now because I'm going to get this wrong. But basically, the way that works isn't that we feed the thing a bunch of Florencio replays and then it learns from them. Kind of what they do is they take multiple, if you can imagine the AI as a little box, right? They take two of these little boxes and they don't know anything, right? They're literally looking at the entire possibility space of what you can do in StarCraft, and they're taking random actions. And then they are assigning a score to the outcome of those actions. They're a very convoluted process that I won't get into. And because it's a computer, it's an AI playing an AI, they're able to do this very fast, right? And they're not running this process one time, but they're running it thousands of times concurrently, or tens of thousands, right? Because it's Google, right? So they don't care about money. So just burn money to spin up tons and tons of these computers and make them play each other, and they don't have to play at real-time speed like we do. They can play as fast as the computer can run the calculations, right? So that's kind of how the machine learning works. They take this huge possibility space and they just brute force it. Like, they just try random shit and see what works. And I believe they did have to do some kind of bootstrapping where they did feed it a little bit of seed data, because literally getting over the hump of like, I should immediately make a worker. Like, there are so many other wrong things you can do besides take no action and let the probes mine until you have enough to make another probe, right? That they weren't clearing that hurdle. But once you get into like actual strategic stuff and like the cool stalker micro that we were seeing when they did that big demonstration, all of that stuff comes from just letting them run against each other and see what scores better. They don't know that it makes sense to pull a stalker back until one of them randomly happens to choose that from the possibility space. Notice that it generated a better outcome. And then over many, many, many millions of iterations, it goes, oh, okay, stalker micro. And then it kind of gets it. So to seriously answer the question of, can we make a Florencio AI? The only way that we could do that is if it kind of just happens, right? I guess maybe in the same way that they seeded the information of, hey, like, just chill for a minute and get your first worker out, you could maybe do something like that. But I would imagine that the kinds of like cool strats and stuff that we think of when we think of someone as like iconic and human-like as Florencio is, I don't know that it would be easy to codify that in a way that they could bootstrap the AI. So that's my serious answer to that one.
So is that why then? It's an really interesting thing, because I don't work in computer science, but do you think that's why there's sort of this like the majority of people playing StarCraft play sort of this macro style because that's the efficient way to win a lot of games, right? Because that's what we've kind of de facto assumed in StarCraft, that you should be getting multiple bases, you should be getting a lot of units out, and then go crush the opponent. And we've been told that by a number of people in the community, as well as like the progression of Brood War skill was centered around like, oh crap, we can take a base and like build more than just a few workers and like build more army that way faster. Do you think that's a result of that?
That's an interesting question. So this kind of harkens back to a discussion we were having on your stream when I came in lacking ignition and needed a little pep talk, and you maligned one of the heroes of StarCraft. I won't say which one. But no, on a serious note, I think it's a very fascinating question to pose, and I wonder if it were true before, but might not be now. So by that I mean, Legacy of the Void was a paradigm shift in the way StarCraft 2 works, in the sense that one base all-ins aren't really a thing anymore, right? Like, I mean, now all the cannon rushers are screaming, but you know, outside of something like that, or I mean, I guess there's proxy racks. And there's a handful of things, but it's not like it was in Wings. It's not like it was in Hots, where you know you start off, the worker count is halved, and the game is so slow for the beginning. And if you don't worker scout, and somebody's intention is just to six pool you, like you're screwed, right? You have workers and they have zerglings, and their zerglings are going to beat your workers right at the end.
Yeah.
Um, so but on the flip side of that, right? If you just scout it, then you don't die, and it's like super easy to not die back then.
Hmm.
Whereas like that line has been blurred a little bit because the game starts up quicker, so you have a little bit more of an economy behind these kind of one base all-ins that you can do, right? Um, so I don't really have an opinion, I guess, but it's a very interesting question to pose because a lot of that wisdom was generated either out of Brood War or out of Wings and Hots, right? And
Hmm.
we're in a very different game now than we were then. Like, Legacy of the Void isn't really like either of those other games. Artosis is fond of saying that it's almost a half step between the two. So that would
Yeah.
maybe be an argument in favor of yes, okay, unfortunately macro is the one true style. But um, I definitely think it's an interesting question,
Yeah.
and worth examining for sure.
Yeah, and I think Wings was definitely like essentially a graphical facelift with some new units
Mm,
to Starcraft.
mm-hmm.
Because Wings was a lot closer to Brood War than Legacy is to Brood War,
Hmm.
in that you didn't have an F2, and like there's
Ah,
so
I
many
see.
things that you had to do that are different, that
Mm-hmm.
are quality of life things that are they've done in Starcraft
Mm-hmm.
Legacy of the Void, which I'm totally fine with. I think it's totally fine to have two different types of games. There's no problem with that.
Mm-hmm.
But Wings was sort of the progression that they were heading in, and it I don't even know if Legacy is the final vision of what they
Mm-hmm.
want Starcraft to be, but it is interesting that you bring that up.
Yeah, it
Very
almost
cool.
it sounds like you're almost thinking about it on a different axis than the Artosis quote that I'm thinking of. So,
Mm,
I think what you're saying is true, right? Like they, yeah, we didn't in Wings have a lot of these nice to haves that we have now. We have some of them, right? Control groups, for example. But yeah, it
yeah.
was they took all of the assumptions from Brood War and they just straight ported them, right? Starting worker count and whatnot. Um,
Right.
what Artosis was saying in the quote that I was referencing, and maybe I explained it poorly, is that you have at one end of the continuum Brood War, at the other end of the continuum Hots and Wings, and then in the middle is Legacy of the Void. And what he's talking about with that is very specific. It's that Brood War is a mechanical game, and
Yeah.
Heart of the Swarm is a strategic game, and you win those two games in very different ways, and that Legacy of the Void is kind of this funny little, StarCraft 1.5 sort of medium point in
Mm,
between the two, where you can win with mechanics or you can win with strategy and doing crazy Florencio stuff and just making your opponent's brain blow up. Or you can do a blend of the two. Like there's kind of anything that you want, and I don't
mm.
know. It's kind of interesting to think that depending on what lens you view it, the continuum shifts in that way.
Yeah, Casually Explained said this a similar thing
Mm.
about coming back to StarCraft,
Mm-hmm.
and it was that in Wings it was basically, as a Protoss player, just go get Colossus and go win.
Yeah.
And there was a few builds you needed to worry about, but the decision tree was much smaller.
Mm-hmm.
But in Legacy of the Voids, it's like, okay, you have I said Legacy of the Voids, Legacy of the Void. You have 10 different things you have to worry about, and you can't just go build Colossus and win.
Mm-hmm.
Although probably all the Terrans are like, yeah, you can, but like, you know what I mean. So, anyways, I think it's a really interesting session, especially the AI development and future of sort of what we're going to see in StarCraft, and when it comes to like computers learning this game, and like,
Mm-hmm.
can we learn anything from how computers learn this game, would be an
Right.
interesting question to answer.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you've been talking, I'm dumping all the social media links and everything. I grabbed the Spotify, but I know we have a couple of other places where we are as well, right?
It's on iTunes as well. You can just search the Archive Book Club. You'll find it on iTunes, and if anybody wants the RSS, we can get that as
Hmm.
well.